Hello, I'm Dr. Nina Burrows. I'm a psychologist and I specialise in the psychology of sexual abuse. Sexual abuse is a topic we tend to talk a lot about in society. It seems to be constantly in the press. But if you look at the conversations we have around sexual abuse, they tend to boil down to one question. Who do we blame for sexual abuse? Sometimes when you're an expert at something, it's your job to answer other people's questions. And sometimes when you're an expert at something, it's your job to say, you know what, I don't think we're asking the most useful types of questions on this issue. So let me do both of those now. Who do we blame for sexual abuse? I don't actually like the word blame. If I'm blaming somebody for something, normally what I'm doing in that moment is trying to push the issue as far away from me as possible to try to avoid looking at any responsibility that I might have for the issue. So if we were to change the question slightly and say, which group of people should we hold most responsible for sexual abuse? I think that is a useful question. And the answer to that question is the perpetrators, the sex offenders. They are the group of people that we should hold most responsible for sexual abuse. So having answered that question, let me say that when it comes to sexual abuse, I really don't think we're asking the most useful types of questions. I meet many people who are scared, confused, and they're frustrated because sexual abuse seems to be constantly in the press, but things don't seem to be getting any better. I find that if you take the time to sit down and talk to these people, most people have many questions about sexual abuse, but they don't feel that they're questions they've ever had the chance to ask before. Unfortunately, as a psychologist who specialises in the psychology of sexual abuse, I can think of quite a few reasons why it's relatively easy for a sex offender to get away with their offence. In this video, I'd like to focus on what I see as one of the main problems, and I'd like to tell you a couple of things about sex offenders that probably no one's ever told you before. I want to be really clear that the group of people that we should all hold responsible for sexual abuse are the abusers, the sex offenders. But there's a group of people who are unwittingly facilitating their behaviour. They're helping them get away with it. And that group of people includes me and you. All of us are quite understandably frightened about sexual abuse. It's the kind of crime that is terrifying to think about. And when I'm frightened by something, I want to do whatever I can to get rid of that fear. I want to feel like I'm back in control again. In the case of sexual abuse, one of the things I can do is focus on the aspects of sexual abuse that make me feel like I am in control. So I focus on the stranger, on the dangerous person hanging around the alleyway late at night, on the paedophile who's in the playground. Focusing on that particular type of offender makes me feel like I'm in control because I feel like there's something I can do about it. In order to avoid sexual abuse, all I need to do is to avoid them and teach the people I love to avoid them too. Whilst it is completely understandable that all of us would like a sense of control when it comes to something as scary as sexual abuse, our willful blindness to the truth creates a smokescreen. It's a smokescreen that helps sex offenders continue to offend undetected, and it's a smokescreen that chokes their victims and makes us deaf to their words. If we want to reduce the prevalence and impact of sexual abuse, that means that more of us need to open our eyes to the reality of sexual abuse. So I want to talk to you about two different types of sex offender that maybe you've never thought about before. The first sex offender I want to talk to you about is the sex offender who would like to get away with their offence. When we focus on the stranger, we're thinking about somebody who attacks their victims in a public place. The sex offender who'd like to get away with their offence is very unlikely to commit that type of offence. When you attack somebody in public, you risk somebody else intervening whilst you're committing your offence. The victim of that crime is very likely to report it to the police. And when the police investigate, they will have an evidence-rich case. There may be CCTV and witnesses. There are likely to be injuries, DNA evidence. They're going to have public support to try and catch this dangerous criminal. And when the jury hear the evidence of this case, they're unlikely to struggle to return a verdict of guilty. So the sex offender who would like to get away with their offence is likely to use very different tactics. They are going to select a victim that they already have easy access to, somebody who already trusts them, someone who trusts them enough to happily go with them to a location where the sex offender can commit their offence without anybody else interrupting them. The sex offender who wants to get away with their offence is unlikely to use violence because injuries can be used as evidence. They're also unlikely to need to use violence because most people, when they're attacked, freeze and offer no physical resistance. After the offence, the sex offender who wants to get away with their offence will try to confuse, intimidate or manipulate their victim so that they don't report the crime to the police. They will try to convince them that what happened wasn't a sex offence. They will try to convince them that what happened was the victim's fault. In case the victim does choose to report to the police, the sex offender who wants to make sure they get away with their offence will select a victim that other people will struggle to believe. Maybe they won't believe them because they were taking drugs or alcohol. Maybe they won't believe them because they have learning difficulties or they're otherwise vulnerable. Maybe they won't believe them because they've tried to report sexual abuse before and no one believed them that time. The second type of sex offender that I would like to talk to you about is the sex offender who isn't ready to admit to themselves that they are a sex offender. Admitting to yourself that you've committed a sex offence is a psychologically very difficult thing to do because it can be a huge threat to your self-concept. We all like to think of ourselves as good people. Sex offenders are no different to anybody else in this respect. So this type of offender will dismiss, minimise and normalise their offending behaviour. They will tell themselves that this is what everybody else does. This type of offender is very unlikely to attack somebody in a public place because if you commit that type of offence, it would be very hard to tell yourself that you're doing anything other than committing a sex offence. So this particular type of offender is also going to select a victim that they already have easy access to, somebody who trusts them enough to go to a location where they can commit the offence without anybody else intervening. They're likely to use drugs and alcohol to lower their own inhibitions as well as the inhibitions of their victim. They're also not likely to use violence because they're trying to convince themselves that what they're doing is having normal sex. After the offence, this type of offender is likely to be very charming to their victim because they're going to be trying to convince both themselves and their victim that what just happened wasn't a sex offence. If any of their victims ever report the crime to the police, the sex offender who isn't ready to admit to themselves that they are a sex offender is likely to be shocked because the lie they've been telling themselves all of this time is that what they're doing is normal. And if you've been telling yourself that lie for 20 years, that probably has become your reality. If we think about these two different types of sex offender and we think about our smoke screen, we can see that by only focusing on the aspects of sexual abuse that make us feel in control, by only focusing on the stranger, we are willfully blind to the sex offender who wants to get away with their offence, and we are helping the sex offender who isn't ready to admit to themselves that they are a sex offender by colluding with their story. When this particular sex offender hears our stories about monsters in alleyways, all that does is reassure them that what they're doing is normal. If we want to reduce the prevalence and impact of sexual abuse in society, that means that more of us need to open our eyes to the reality of sexual abuse. Doing so won't be easy. But if together we can get rid of the smokescreen, we can make life much harder for sex offenders. We can make life much better for their victims. And we can make life safer for you and me. If you'd like to play your part in getting rid of the smokescreen, please share this video. If you were my friend and you were to come to me and tell me that you'd experienced some form of sexual abuse, and you were to ask me, did I think that you should go and find some kind of therapy? My answer would be yes. Yes, because I would want the best for you. Yes, because given the choice, I would much rather you had too much support than too little. Many people who experience sexual abuse can struggle to ask for help. They can think that what happened to them doesn't count. They can think that what happened to them was their fault, so they don't deserve any help. They can think that because what happened was so many years ago, they should be over it by now, and why would they risk shaking things up and maybe making things worse? It's true that everybody who experiences sexual abuse finds some way of coping. They do the best they can to look after themselves and get on with their lives. But there can be a big difference between coping and living. Sometimes it takes someone else to point out to you how small and restricted your world has become in your efforts to cope with your experience. I think a good example of this can be sexual intimacy. Sex after sexual abuse could be difficult for everyone, and it can be an example of an area of your life that you've given up on. If you were my friend, I would want you to have a life that is as full as it would have been if you hadn't had this experience. I want the same for you too. Asking for help isn't easy. It can be frightening. It can mean talking about something that maybe you've never talked about before. It can mean recognizing that what happened to you was real and that it's still affecting you today. I think a lot of people can also be reluctant to seek therapy for sexual abuse because they think that in the therapy they're going to have to talk about their abuse in great detail from the very beginning all the way through to the end. It's true that talking about what you've experienced may form part of your therapy, but it's a relatively small part and it's certainly not where you need to begin. Therapy is much more about learning to cope with today and finding a way of becoming the person you want to be tomorrow. If getting therapy straight away feels like too much for you, then try something smaller. Maybe just phone a helpline. I've volunteered on a helpline before. It's perfectly okay to phone the number and say to the person at the other end of the line, you know what, today I just promised myself that I would make the call, but I'm not ready to speak to you today. So I'm going to hang up and I hope that I phone you again soon. I promise you, they will understand. If you're not sure whether or not you deserve therapy or whether or not you're ready, please read my book, The Courage to Be Me, because I created it for you. You can read the whole book on my website. I hope it helps you find the courage that you need to get the help that you deserve. This question comes from the team at Psychologies magazine. This month the magazine is looking at the topic of power, and they've asked me to explain the relationship between power and sexual abuse. I'm going to do that looking at it from the perspective of victims of sexual abuse. When we talk about recovery from sexual abuse, we often focus on trauma. But one of the reasons why sexual abuse is so difficult to recover from and can take so long to recover from is because sexual abuse is a crime against the self. Myself is my ability to make choices and live those choices. It's about my agency and my ability to have an impact on my world. In the case of sexual abuse, somebody is forced to live through an experience that goes against their choice, or they're forced to live through an experience that they're too young to choose. Recovery means learning how to become a self again, taking back your power. But this can be very difficult for anyone who's experienced sexual abuse because a key part of my power is my willingness and ability to be aware of its limitations. My strength comes from my ability to live with vulnerability. This can be hard for anyone who's experienced sexual abuse, because to experience abuse is to experience something that makes you feel very vulnerable. It can be a huge challenge to open your eyes to vulnerability again. This is why the book I've created about life after sexual abuse is called The Courage to Be Me, because being a self and feeling your power takes a great deal of courage. We don't spend nearly enough time focusing on the many men who are out there living with the impact of sexual abuse that they experienced as a child, or a rape that they experienced in adulthood. I think it doesn't even occur to many people that men can also be victims of these types of crimes. They can, and the numbers are much bigger than many people realise. Around 8% of victims of rape are men. Taking data from England and Wales alone, we can estimate that the equivalent of 1 man an hour is a victim of rape. If people do think about the rape of men, they normally assume that it's something that only happens in prisons or within the gay community. This isn't correct. Men can be raped anywhere in society. Many men who are raped are heterosexual, and many of the men who rape them are in relationships with women. I think we focus on prisons and the gay community because it's our way of making sense of something that we find very confusing. But this means that if you're a heterosexual man and you are a victim of rape, one of the things that you can struggle with afterwards is your sexual orientation. You can wonder whether your attacker saw something in you that made them think that you were gay. You can wonder why you didn't fight your attacker off. Was it because you were enjoying it? And something else that can make rape incredibly confusing for both men and women is that it's not at all uncommon to have a sexual response during the attack. In the case of men, this means that they can get an erection. If you've had this experience, it's really important that you know that this response was outside of your conscious control. Our sexual responses are outside our conscious control. This is why fantasy can play such an important role in sex. If you've had this experience, please know that it does not mean that you were enjoying it. It does not mean that you were consenting to what happened. And if you are a straight man and you were raped, it does not mean that you were gay. There are a number of reasons why someone convicted of a sex offence may claim that they're innocent. Let's deal with the elephant in the room first. It is, of course, possible that they are innocent, but around 30% of people who are convicted of a sex offence continue to claim that they are innocent long after their conviction. If all of these people truly are innocent, it would represent a miscarriage of justice on an epic scale. So what else might be going on? Some offenders are simply trying to get away with it. They know that they're guilty, but they're playing the system, trying to see if an appeal will work. Others maintain their innocence because of their friends and family. When someone's arrested for a sex offence, the people who love them believe them when they say that they didn't do it. They stand by them through a lengthy court process. They probably have to put up with abuse and prejudice from others. It can be very difficult for an offender to subsequently admit their guilt. They risk losing the one group of people who still have any faith in them. Another reason why some sex offenders continue to claim that they are innocent is because they genuinely believe that it is true. Committing a sex offence is a psychologically difficult thing to do. The core of our psychological health is our self-concept, our sense of who we are. And all of us, even people who commit sex offences, like to think of ourselves as good people. Put simply, the challenge of committing a sex offence is that you need to do something bad whilst maintaining the idea that you are good, which means you need to deceive yourself. This is something that we all do, and we're good at it. We constantly tell ourselves stories where we come out okay. When we get a speeding ticket, we don't say that we were rightly caught and punished. We complain. We complain because we were simply keeping up with the other traffic. We complain because the speeding limit should be lower there. And we complain because the police should be out there catching the real criminals. Sex offenders are the same. They deny, minimise, distort and justify their own behaviour. They blame everyone and everything apart from themselves. And they do this for important psychological reasons. The thing that they're struggling with is integrity. They face the challenge of trying to integrate the bad thing that they have done with their idea of the good person that they want to be. It's a very difficult challenge. It means facing up and working through your own self-deception. And it means opening your eyes to the worst of your own behaviour, which can be a huge threat to your self-concept. Most people aren't up to the challenge, so they take the easier route out. They protect their self-concept by denying their guilt. And this is sad. It's sad not only for their victim, who is the person they're most likely to blame for what happened, but it's sad for them. Denying a wrong you have done is a dead-end road. You end up wallowing in your own pool of bitterness and false perception that you're being persecuted. It's a situation that's hard to see anyone in. It's like watching somebody stagnating when they could be growing. My hope for anybody who is guilty of a sex offence is that they find the strength of character to integrate the bad thing that they have done with the things that they know inside themselves that are good. They need to take all of that energy that they're putting into proving their innocence and instead prove their worth. Stop telling us that you're still a good person. Show us. Although I'm afraid that not all of us will be able to see it, because we live in a society that refuses to see sex offenders as anything but monsters. We have to get rid of this image. When we portray all sex offenders as monsters, we help sex offenders deny their offence. They look at that image and they say, that's not me, that's not what I did, I must be innocent. And it doesn't give them any incentive to change. You might as well cling to the false hope of innocence if the alternative is to be permanently labelled a monster. Our struggle to let go of this image of a monster reflects our own struggles with integrity. As a society, we need to find a way of integrating the people that we see as the worst in us with our ideas of the kind of society we want to be. It's in everybody's interests that sex offenders are able to change, but we need to make room for that change. Until we do, our behaviour won't be that much different from a sex offender who refuses to admit their guilt. We will refuse to open our eyes to the truth. We'll blame the victims. Our conversations about abuse will be full of bitterness. Nothing will change. We'll stagnate. I choose to believe that all of us can do better than that. This has got to be the most important question that we can ask about sexual abuse. How do we keep our kids safe? Many people try to keep their children safe from sexual abuse by teaching them to avoid strangers. In this video, I'm going to explain why we need to stop focusing on strangers, and then I'm going to talk about the kinds of messages that we should be giving our children and teenagers. The thought of a child we love being the victim of sexual abuse is terrifying. Of course, all of us would want to do whatever we could to prevent that from happening. And wouldn't it be really reassuring if there was something we could teach our children that would mean that they are able to prevent their own abuse? And wouldn't it be really reassuring if the dangers were easy to spot and if they were out there in public places, not in our own homes? This is why the stranger danger message is so popular. We teach our kids to avoid this guy because he reassures us. No one in my family looks like him. None of my friends look like him. I focus on him because it helps me avoid a much more uncomfortable truth. If a child I love is ever the victim of sexual abuse, they are much more likely to be abused by a member of the family, a friend, or a trusted professional than a stranger. As adults, we need to learn how to live with our fears about sexual abuse so that our children stand a chance of living in safety. That's the trade-off. our fears, their safety. Many people at the moment, perhaps without realising it, are choosing a false sense of reassurance over the actual safety of their children. We need to find the courage to open our eyes to the realities of sexual abuse, because our ignorance is the greatest risk our children face. So let's talk about those realities, because we can't protect our children from the real risks of sexual abuse if we don't know what the real risks are. In this video, I've chosen to highlight a particular risk, not because it's the greatest risk that your child faces, but because it's the biggest risk that we're not talking about, and because I think it helps to place the stranger danger message into perspective. It's an area of sexual abuse that even many professionals struggle to give the attention that it deserves, but not talking about it is not helping. This is where you are going to need your courage, because what I'm going to tell you is not going to be easy to hear. But being courageous isn't about running away from the things that make us feel uncomfortable. It's about standing up and facing them. So let me give you an uncomfortable truth. Your child is 3 times more likely to be sexually abused by another child than an adult stranger. Estimates vary, but around 30% of child sexual abuse is perpetrated by somebody who is under the age of 18. Why is this happening? It's happening because we are raising our children with messages about stranger danger, and they are not realising that what they're experiencing is sexual abuse. They don't realise that it's wrong, and they are acting out the same behaviours on the children around them. It's happening because whilst most children who are sexually abused do not go on to become abusers, some do. It is this awful cycle where sexual abuse gets paid forward from child to child, whilst the adults around them remain blind to it. And it is happening because paedophilia can be present from early adolescence, but we don't think about the young people in our communities who know that they are sexually attracted to children, who don't necessarily want to offend, but for whom support services are far too scarce. It is a simple fact that if these young people get the support that they need, they are much less likely to go on and offend in adulthood. And it is happening because the teenagers in our lives are learning about sex using internet porn. They are having early sexual encounters that are violent and abusive, and many of them don't even realise that what they are doing is wrong, because no one is there to tell them that it is. We are living in a world where our children are sexually abusing each other, and we're not even talking about it. This is how much the world needs to wake up to the realities of sexual abuse, and this is how misplaced our safety messages are. So what messages should we be teaching our children and teenagers? We can't rely on children to realise that what they are experiencing is sexual abuse and that it's wrong, so we need to help them understand. For young children, teach them that the parts of their body that are covered by their underpants are special. They are allowed to touch themselves there, but they shouldn't play any games with other people that involve touching those parts of the body. Teach your children about their own bodies and give them names for everything. Young boys tend to grow up knowing that they've got a penis, but we tend to leave young girls in ignorance. How can your daughter tell you that somebody has touched her vagina if she didn't even know she had one and she hasn't got a word for it? We want our girls to grow up knowing their bodies, owning their bodies, and feeling unashamed of them. Don't let your embarrassment get in the way of that. We also want our children to grow up knowing that they get to make choices about their own body and that those choices should be respected by other people. So be the kind of family that respects each other's choices about your own bodies. If you are tickling a child and they ask you to stop, then stop. If your child doesn't want to kiss every single relative goodnight, then don't force them to. Help them learn that it is okay for them to say no. Be the kind of family that can talk about the hard stuff. A good family isn't a family with no problems, it's a family with many problems, but they're able to talk about them and work through them together. Make sure your kids can talk to you, and when they talk to you, listen. Not being believed by the people who are supposed to protect you can cause just as much damage as the original abuse, and it leaves your child wide open to further abuse. So if your child is trying to tell you something, believe them. Make sure that your children know that you will always be proud of them for telling you the truth, even if the thing that they have to say to you is hard to hear, and live up to that promise. And for the teenagers in our lives, we have to start talking to them about sex and relationships. Schools have got a role to play here, but parents have got the greater responsibility. Our teenagers need role models. Sex is a psychological minefield full of vulnerabilities about our bodies, fears about performance and intimacy. We need to help our young people navigate this space in a way that is emotionally healthy as well as physically healthy. All of this means that you need a plan. Talk to your partner, talk to other parents. If your kids are old enough, talk to them. Decide how your family is going to live with the real risks of sexual abuse in a way that gives everybody the freedom that they need to grow. And as a society, we need to replicate what every family needs to do. We need to find the courage to open our eyes to the real risks and make sure that the most vulnerable members of our community aren't paying a price for our ignorance. We need to find a way of having the difficult conversations. All of us have got a role to play in this. Making these videos, this is my way of keeping the kids I love safe from sexual abuse. Let's keep everybody's kids safe. Please, share this video.